He believed every language could be bought, every expert could be hired, and every mind could be measured by the suit it wore. He was about to discover how expensive that mistake could become. Richard Castellano stood at the head of the 40-foot mahogany conference table, his tailored charcoal suit as sharp as the silence surrounding him. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago, where the late afternoon sun washed the skyline in molten gold. Around him sat attorneys from New York, financial advisors from London, and trusted executives who had spent decades earning the privilege of entering this room. Crystal glasses reflected warm light across polished wood. Expensive leather folders rested neatly before every chair, and not a single person dared interrupt while Richard studied the weathered parchment that had just arrived from a private collector in Rome. The document represented the final piece of a multi-million-dollar acquisition involving an estate that had belonged to an aristocratic family for centuries. Every signature mattered. Every word mattered. Yet one section remained untranslated because the final paragraph had been written in an unusually complex form of medieval Latin that none of the professionals around the table could confidently interpret. Frustration settled over the room like invisible smoke. One attorney cleared his throat before quietly admitting they would need another specialist. Richard's jaw tightened. He hated delays. He hated uncertainty even more. At that exact moment, the soft sound of a cleaning cart rolling across marble echoed outside the conference room. The heavy oak door opened just enough for Naomi Carter to step inside, carrying fresh coffee. She moved with practiced quietness, her dark uniform spotless, her natural curls gathered neatly behind her head, her eyes lowered as she placed steaming cups beside each guest without disturbing the discussion. She had worked inside the Castellano mansion for only 3 months, and everyone had already learned the same lesson about her. She was invisible. Invisible people cleaned the floors before sunrise, polished crystal until it reflected faces like mirrors, and disappeared before powerful conversations began. Richard barely glanced at her as he folded the document shut with visible irritation. One of the executives laughed under his breath. Looks like even Europe's greatest scholars couldn't figure this one out. Another smiled confidently. Maybe we should frame it instead of translating it. Laughter spread around the table, breaking the tension. Naomi quietly reached for the empty coffee pot nearest Richard, but as she lifted it, the corner of the ancient document briefly caught her attention. Her eyes paused for only a heartbeat. Something about the handwriting looked strangely familiar. Before she could stop herself, she looked once more. It was instinct, not curiosity. Richard noticed. His cold blue eyes followed her gaze. The room became still. "Do you recognize something?" he asked, his voice calm enough to make everyone else uncomfortable. Naomi immediately lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir." She intended to step away, but one of the lawyers smirked. "Maybe she knows something we don't." More laughter followed. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair, amusement replacing irritation. "Interesting," he said, tapping one finger against the edge of the parchment. "You looked at it like you understood it." Naomi remained silent. Every rule inside the mansion had taught her never to answer questions that weren't truly invitations. Richard's smile widened just enough to reveal quiet confidence. "Go ahead." The executives exchanged amused glances. One reached for his drink as though settling in for entertainment. Richard slid the document across the polished table until it stopped inches from Naomi's hands. Then translate it. A few people laughed openly now. Someone whispered that this might be the shortest career in the house. Another shook his head with a grin, already expecting embarrassment. Naomi looked neither offended nor frightened. She simply stared at the faded ink, breathing once before carefully lifting the fragile page with both hands as though it deserved respect rather than attention. The laughter slowly faded. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not confusion. Recognition. Richard noticed it immediately. For the first time since she had entered the room, she was no longer looking at the document like a housekeeper dusting antiques. She was studying it like someone greeting an old friend. And in that single silent moment, before she spoke a single word, Richard Castellano felt something he could not explain. The certainty that whatever happened next would change the atmosphere of his boardroom forever. No one in the conference room noticed that Naomi Carter had stopped breathing for the briefest moment. The faded symbols resting beneath her fingertips were not simply old words preserved on fragile parchment. They belonged to a language she had once lived and loved long before polished marble floors and housekeeping uniforms became her daily reality. She carefully placed the coffee pot back onto the silver serving tray without making a sound. Around the table, several executives exchanged amused smiles, convinced they were about to witness an awkward moment that would become another story told over expensive dinners. Richard Castellano watched her with quiet curiosity, his arms folded across his chest. He had expected fear, embarrassment, perhaps even tears. Instead, the young woman standing before him seemed strangely calm. Naomi slowly traced one sentence with her eyes, moving from left to right as naturally as someone reading a familiar novel. She did not rush. She did not pretend. She simply read. One of the attorneys leaned toward another and whispered, "She does not even know what she is looking at." A soft laugh followed. Another executive shook his head. "This should take about 5 seconds." Richard said nothing. Something about Naomi's expression refused to match the expectations of everyone else in the room. She was not searching for meaning. She appeared to be confirming it. After nearly half a minute of complete silence, Naomi finally lifted her eyes from the parchment. "This is not classical Latin," she said quietly. Every smile disappeared. "It is a transitional legal form that combines medieval Latin with regional Italian terminology used by northern estates during the late 15th century. No one interrupted her. The room suddenly felt much larger than before. One attorney blinked twice before reaching for the document, as though he needed to verify that they were looking at the same page. Richard remained perfectly still. "Continue," he said. Naomi nodded respectfully. "Several words here appear unusual because the spelling reflects local pronunciation rather than formal legal standards. If someone translated this literally, they would misunderstand the ownership clause." One executive frowned. "Ownership clause?" Naomi gently pointed toward the lower section of the parchment without touching the ink itself. "Yes, sir. The sentence does not transfer permanent ownership. It grants temporary stewardship under specific seasonal conditions." Another lawyer immediately leaned forward. "That cannot be correct." Naomi looked toward him politely rather than defensively. "I understand why it sounds unusual. The wording changed after regional reforms, but this manuscript still uses the earlier structure." Silence returned. Richard slowly walked around the conference table until he stood beside her. From this distance, he could clearly see that her attention never wandered. She studied every letter with remarkable patience, almost as if she respected the anonymous scholar who had written it centuries earlier. "Where did you learn this?" Richard asked. Naomi lowered her eyes again. "I learned many years ago, sir." It was a careful answer, revealing almost nothing. Richard noticed it immediately. She had answered without actually answering. The attorneys began comparing handwritten notes, flipping through digital references on their tablets. One searched an academic database. Another opened an online legal archive. Their confidence gradually faded as every source they checked seemed to support the explanation Naomi had given only moments earlier. The executive who had laughed first quietly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. No one seemed interested in making another joke. Richard looked from the parchment to Naomi once again. He had spent his entire career judging people within seconds. Confidence, deception, competence, weakness. Those instincts had protected him for years. Yet nothing about the woman standing beside him fit the life she appeared to be living. Housekeepers did not casually recognize rare medieval legal language. Housekeepers did not explain linguistic evolution with calm precision while standing beside billion-dollar negotiations. More importantly, they did not remain humble after proving an entire room of experts wrong. Naomi gently folded her hands in front of her apron. "Would you like me to continue translating the remaining sections, sir?" she asked softly. Richard did not answer immediately. His blue eyes remained fixed on hers, searching for the truth hidden behind remarkable restraint. For the first time since Naomi Carter had entered his household, he was no longer wondering whether she belonged in the conference room. He was beginning to wonder how someone like her had ever ended up cleaning one. Richard Castellano slowly returned to his seat without taking his eyes off Naomi Carter. The silence surrounding the conference table no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to curiosity. Every executive who had laughed only minutes earlier now avoided speaking too quickly, afraid of exposing another assumption that might collapse in front of them. Richard rested one hand on the ancient parchment before looking toward the legal team assembled around him. One explanation is impressive, he said evenly. Luck is possible. Let us find out whether this is knowledge or coincidence. An older attorney reached into his leather briefcase and removed another folder that had remained unopened throughout the meeting. Inside rested 3 separate reproductions collected from European archives during previous negotiations. None of them had ever been fully translated because each combined different legal traditions and regional dialects. The attorney placed them side by side across the polished mahogany table. These were never shared with one another, he explained. Each comes from a different century. Richard gave a slight nod before looking at Naomi again. Translate the opening passage from each document. Nobody smiled this time. Naomi stepped closer, carefully studying the first page. She read silently, for several moments before speaking in the same calm voice that never sought attention. This one begins with a ceremonial declaration rather than a contract. The family is acknowledging stewardship of farmland during years of poor harvests. She moved to the second document. This one is different. The handwriting imitates church records, but the legal terminology belongs to commercial guilds. Whoever wrote it wanted the agreement to appear more formal than it actually was. Several attorneys immediately began comparing her observations with historical reference materials on their tablets. Richard noticed the speed with which their expressions changed from skepticism to concentration. Naomi continued to the third manuscript. She paused slightly longer before speaking. This final document contains an error introduced by a later copyist. One sentence repeats the same title twice. The original writer probably intended 2 different offices, but the duplication changed the legal meaning. The room became perfectly still again. One of the historians attending remotely through a large video screen leaned closer until his face nearly filled the display. Can you show me the line? Naomi respectfully pointed toward a faded section near the bottom without touching the page itself. The historian adjusted his glasses and remained silent for nearly a full minute. Finally, he exhaled slowly. She is correct. No excitement colored his voice, only quiet amazement. We overlooked that duplication for years because every surviving copy contains the same mistake. Another attorney looked almost embarrassed as he closed 3 academic articles that had failed to identify the error. Richard folded his hands together. Explain how you recognized it. Naomi hesitated, not because she lacked the answer, but because she seemed uncomfortable discussing herself. Older manuscripts often reveal patterns, she said gently. Writers repeat habits. When one pattern suddenly changes, it usually means someone else copied the text later. She spoke as naturally as someone explaining how rain clouds gathered before a storm. There was no arrogance in her tone, no desire to impress anyone, only respect for the language itself. Richard observed every detail. She never raised her voice. She never looked around the room to measure people's reactions. She never celebrated proving experienced professionals wrong. Instead, she waited quietly beside the conference table with the same composed posture she had maintained while serving coffee only minutes earlier. That contrast unsettled him more than her remarkable knowledge. One executive finally broke the silence. Miss Carter, did you study linguistics? Naomi offered a polite smile without answering directly. I was fortunate to learn from wonderful teachers many years ago. Again, she revealed almost nothing. Richard recognized deliberate restraint when he saw it. Everyone carried secrets. Powerful men protected theirs with expensive security systems. Ordinary people protected theirs with silence. Naomi belonged to the second group. Richard looked once more at the weathered documents spread across the table before making a decision that surprised everyone present, including himself. He slid the remaining unopened folder toward Naomi. There is one final document, he said quietly. Nobody in this room has been able to explain a single sentence inside it. If you can, then I no longer believe chance has anything to do with what we have witnessed today. Naomi slowly lifted the final folder, and the instant her eyes reached the first page, the peaceful confidence on her face disappeared for the very first time. Naomi Carter did not open the final folder immediately. Her fingers rested lightly on the aged cover, while an expression Richard Castellano had not seen before crossed her face. It was neither fear nor hesitation. It was recognition mixed with disbelief. The attorneys exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that this document was somehow different from the others. Richard noticed the subtle change as well. "You have seen this style before," he said quietly. Naomi looked up for only a second before lowering her eyes once more. "Not this document, sir," she answered carefully. "But I recognize the collection it belongs to." The words settled over the room with surprising weight. One of the historians on the video conference leaned closer. "That collection disappeared decades ago," he said. "Most scholars believe only fragments survived." Naomi nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. That is why I was surprised." Richard slowly folded his hands together. He had expected another remarkable translation. He had not expected the housekeeper standing beside his conference table to identify the historical origin of a manuscript that specialists around the world rarely discussed. "Open it," he said. Naomi carefully unfolded the brittle pages. Unlike the previous documents, this manuscript contained unusual symbols woven between lines of Latin text. Decorative initials shimmered faintly beneath centuries of faded ink, while handwritten notes crowded the margins in a mixture of Italian, Latin, and abbreviated legal references. Several attorneys had spent months attempting to organize its meaning, yet every translation created new contradictions. Naomi remained silent as her eyes traveled across each page. The executives watched every movement. Nobody reached for a coffee cup. Nobody checked a telephone. Even the city skyline beyond the windows seemed forgotten. Finally, Naomi spoke. "This document was translated incorrectly from the very beginning." An attorney immediately frowned. Every expert reached the same conclusion. Naomi answered with complete respect. "Because they all began reading here." She gently indicated the upper portion of the page. The author did not intend the text to begin there. Several eyebrows lifted at once. Richard stepped beside her once again. "Explain." Naomi pointed toward an illuminated letter hidden near the lower left corner of the parchment. "This manuscript follows a circular reading structure used by a small group of legal scholars. The opening sentence actually begins at the decorated initial below, continues into the margin, returns to the center paragraph, and only then moves back to the top." Complete silence followed. One attorney quickly rearranged digital photographs of the manuscript according to her instructions. As the text was reordered, the confusing passages suddenly formed complete, logical sentences. The historian on the screen slowly removed his glasses, staring in open amazement. "That is impossible," he whispered before correcting himself. "No, that is correct." Richard watched the reconstructed translation appear line by line across the display. For the first time since acquiring the manuscript, every clause connected perfectly. There were no contradictions. No missing references. No unexplained transitions. Naomi had not merely translated forgotten words. She had revealed the correct method for reading the entire document. One executive quietly laughed, not from amusement, but from astonishment. "We hired universities," he murmured. "She solved it in minutes." Naomi did not react. Instead, she continued reading until she reached the final paragraph. Her calm expression slowly changed. Richard noticed it immediately. "There is something else," he said. Naomi looked toward him with quiet concern. "Yes, sir." She rested one finger beside a narrow column of faded annotations. "This section has never been translated because everyone believed it was only decorative commentary." Richard waited. Naomi drew a slow breath before continuing. "It is not commentary. It is a warning written by the original author." Every person in the room leaned forward. Naomi continued in the same steady voice. "The warning explains that anyone who interprets the ownership clauses literally will invalidate the agreement. The document was intentionally designed to expose readers who lack the historical context necessary to understand it." Richard looked from Naomi to the attorneys surrounding the table. Not one of them spoke. The room had witnessed enough surprises for one afternoon, yet somehow the greatest revelation had arrived last. For the first time since the meeting began, Richard Castellano realized that the woman everyone had dismissed as invisible was no longer revealing what she knew. She was revealing how much everyone else had failed to see. Richard Castellano had spent years surrounding himself with people whose expertise carried prestigious titles, impressive offices, and framed diplomas displayed behind polished desks. Yet none of those accomplishments explained what had just unfolded. Inside his conference room, The attorneys remained unusually quiet as they studied the corrected translation now displayed across several large monitors. Every sentence aligned perfectly. Every disputed clause finally made sense. The confusion that had delayed negotiations for months had disappeared because a woman wearing a simple housekeeping uniform understood something none of them had recognized. Richard slowly closed the folder and looked toward Naomi Carter once again. This time there was no trace of amusement in his expression. "Everyone else may leave," he said calmly. The executives hesitated for only a moment before gathering their notebooks and computers. Chairs slid softly across the hardwood floor. Expensive leather briefcases closed with quiet clicks. One by one they filed toward the door, many glancing back at Naomi with expressions that had completely replaced their earlier confidence. A few offered respectful nods before disappearing into the hallway. Even the historians connected by video remained silent until the conference ended. Within 2 minutes, the enormous room that had been filled with conversation now held only Richard and Naomi. The evening sunlight had shifted lower across the skyline, covering the conference table with long golden shadows that softened the sharp lines of polished wood and crystal. Richard remained standing for several seconds before speaking. "Sit down." Naomi looked surprised. "Sir, please." The single word carried none of the authority he normally used when giving instructions. Naomi hesitated before carefully sitting in the chair nearest the end of the table. It was likely the first time she had ever occupied one of the executive seats instead of quietly cleaning around them after meetings had ended. Richard took the chair across from her rather than returning to the head of the table. The distance between them suddenly felt far smaller than before. "You answered every question today," he said. "Except the only one that matters." Naomi lowered her eyes. "Which question is that, sir?" Richard folded his hands together. "Who are you?" The room became silent once again. Naomi looked toward the windows where the final light reflected against neighboring skyscrapers. She seemed to weigh every possible answer before speaking. "I am your housekeeper." Richard almost smiled. "That is your job. It is not your story." Naomi remained quiet. Richard did not interrupt her silence. For the first time in many years, patience seemed more valuable than immediate answers. Nearly a full minute passed before Naomi spoke again. There was another life before this one. Her voice remained steady, but a quiet sadness settled beneath every word. "A life I do not speak about anymore." Richard listened without moving. "I studied ancient languages in graduate school. My professors specialized in historical legal manuscripts because they believed forgotten words could still influence modern justice." Richard absorbed every sentence carefully. Nothing about her manner suggested exaggeration. She described extraordinary accomplishments with the same humility she had shown while serving coffee. "You earned a graduate degree?" he asked softly. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Then why are you cleaning my mansion?" Naomi smiled faintly, though the expression carried no happiness. "Because sometimes losing one opportunity causes every other door to close." Richard did not press further. He recognized pain when he heard it, even when someone carefully hid most of it beneath calm words. Naomi reached into the pocket of her apron and removed a small folded piece of paper that had become worn along the edges from being carried for years. She unfolded it carefully before placing it on the conference table. It was an old library card issued by a university whose name Richard immediately recognized as one of the country's most respected academic institutions. The photograph showed the same woman sitting across from him, only younger, dressed in professional clothing instead of a housekeeping uniform, smiling with quiet confidence. Richard studied the card for several long moments before returning it to her without saying a word. Suddenly, the spotless floors, the polished silver trays, the careful silence, and the invisible routine she had lived inside his home no longer looked ordinary. They looked like the remains of a life interrupted. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair, his eyes never leaving Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said with complete sincerity, "I do not believe this conversation is really about languages anymore." Naomi carefully folded the library card and slipped it back into her pocket. She looked at him with calm dignity before quietly answering, "No, sir. It never was." The conference room remained wrapped in the quiet glow of the Chicago sunset long after the rest of the staff had left for the evening. Outside, thousands of office lights slowly awakened across the city, while inside the mansion time itself seemed to pause. Richard Castellano rested both hands on the polished table, studying Naomi Carter with the same careful attention he usually reserved for difficult negotiations. There was no suspicion left in his expression, only a growing determination to understand the woman sitting across from him. Naomi looked down at the smooth grain of the mahogany table before speaking again. "I graduated at the top of my program," she said softly. "Ancient legal languages became my specialty because I believed history could protect people when modern systems failed." Richard listened without interrupting. Naomi continued in the calm voice that had never once asked for sympathy. "After graduate school, I joined a research institute that partnered with museums, universities, and private collectors. We authenticated historical manuscripts before they were sold or donated." She smiled faintly as old memories surfaced. "It was the happiest time of my life. Every document felt like meeting someone who had been waiting hundreds of years to tell the truth." Richard noticed that her eyes brightened for the first time since the conversation began. They were not bright because she was remembering success. They were bright because she was remembering purpose. "Then everything changed," she said quietly. The warmth disappeared from her voice as quickly as it had appeared. A valuable manuscript disappeared during an international exhibition. Richard remained completely still. Naomi folded her hands together. "I was one of the last researchers assigned to examine it. Before the exhibition closed, when the investigation began, people wanted quick answers instead of careful ones." Richard understood immediately where the story was heading, yet he allowed her to continue in her own time. "There was no evidence that I had done anything wrong," Naomi said. "But there were rumors. Rumors spread faster than facts. Funding disappeared. Interviews were canceled. Invitations stopped coming. Every recommendation I had earned became meaningless because nobody wanted to hire someone connected to a public scandal." She paused before adding one final sentence. "Eventually, I stopped trying to explain." Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. Throughout his career, he had seen reputations destroyed without proof and restored only after years of quiet perseverance. Yet hearing the story from Naomi carried a different weight because she described every loss without bitterness. She spoke as though she had accepted disappointment without allowing it to change her character. "Was the manuscript ever found?" Richard asked. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." Richard looked surprised. Several months later, it was discovered inside a private collection overseas. The disappearance had been caused by a documentation error during international shipping. She smiled gently, though there was sadness behind it. The museum issued a correction. A few newspapers printed short updates. Most people never noticed because the original accusation had already become the story everyone remembered. Richard slowly lowered his eyes. The silence between them became heavier than before. Naomi continued. "By then my apartment lease had ended. My savings were gone. I accepted temporary jobs because they paid immediately. Temporary work became permanent. Eventually I stopped introducing myself as a researcher because nobody believed me anyway." Richard looked around the enormous conference room where multi-million-dollar contracts covered the table. He imagined the countless mornings Naomi had quietly polished these same surfaces while carrying knowledge that could humble nearly every expert who entered the mansion. Nobody had asked her opinion. Nobody had wondered about the life hidden behind the housekeeping uniform. They had simply decided who she was before she ever spoke. Richard finally broke the silence. "When you looked at those manuscripts today, you smiled." Naomi looked toward him with quiet curiosity. Richard continued. "It was the first genuine smile I have seen from you." Naomi looked toward the ancient documents resting peacefully inside their protective folders. "Because for a few minutes," she answered softly, "I remembered the person I used to be." Richard felt those words settle deeply into the room. Wealth could replace buildings. Success could rebuild businesses. But there were losses that no amount of money could quietly repair. As evening shadows stretched across the conference table, Richard Castellano realized that the remarkable translations had never been the greatest discovery of the day. The greatest discovery was that extraordinary talent could disappear in plain sight when the world chose appearance over truth. Richard Castellano remained seated long after the city lights had replaced the evening sun beyond the conference room windows. The ancient manuscripts still rested on the polished mahogany table, but they no longer commanded his attention. His thoughts had shifted entirely toward Naomi Carter. She quietly gathered the empty coffee cups, returning to the familiar routine that had defined her days inside the mansion, as though the extraordinary conversation they had just shared had never happened. Richard watched her carry the silver tray with the same dignity she had displayed while explaining centuries of forgotten legal history. It struck him that she had never once complained about her circumstances. She had simply accepted work that needed to be done and performed it with excellence, whether translating medieval Latin or polishing crystal glasses. As Naomi reached the doorway, Richard spoke without raising his voice. "Miss Carter." She stopped and turned respectfully. "Yes, sir." Richard stood and picked up the final manuscript from the conference table. "There is one more question." Naomi stepped back inside. Richard opened the document to the final translated section she had reconstructed. "Only an hour earlier. You said the warning was meant to expose readers who lacked historical context." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." Richard studied the faded lines again. If someone ignored that warning today, what would actually happen? Naomi walked back toward the table. This time she did not look at the Latin first. Instead, she examined several modern documents lying beneath the manuscript. Purchase agreements, property transfers, legal summaries prepared by Richard's own advisors. Her expression gradually became more serious. Richard noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" Naomi carefully compared one page with another before answering. "May I ask who prepared these modern contracts?" Richard looked toward the law firm's logo printed across the first page. "One of the largest firms in the country." Naomi remained silent for several moments. Then she slowly placed the historical manuscript beside the modern agreement. "Sir, they translated the ancient text correctly after today's revisions." Richard waited. "But they applied it incorrectly to the modern contract." Richard frowned slightly. "Explain." Naomi pointed toward a paragraph near the center of the agreement. "This clause assumes permanent ownership begins immediately after signature." She moved her finger toward the manuscript. "The original legal framework does not allow that. Ownership transfers only after fulfillment of a ceremonial obligation described in the historical text." Richard looked from one document to the other. "Meaning?" Naomi answered with complete composure. "Meaning the property cannot legally become yours on the day this agreement is signed. Under the original framework, another party could challenge the transfer if the ceremonial condition was never completed." Richard's expression hardened, not with anger, but with concentration. Naomi continued. "The warning written in the margin exists for exactly this reason. The author wanted future readers to understand that the visible contract and the hidden legal tradition must always remain together. Separating them creates a fatal misunderstanding." Richard immediately pressed a button on the conference phone. Within moments his chief attorney answered. "Please return to the conference room," Richard said calmly. "Bring every document related to the Florence estate." 20 minutes later, the legal team had gathered once again around the table. The atmosphere was completely different from earlier that afternoon. Nobody underestimated Naomi anymore. Richard simply handed the agreement to his lead attorney. "Review the transfer schedule." The attorney read for several minutes before looking up confidently. "Everything appears standard." Richard nodded toward Naomi. "Would you explain?" Naomi politely summarized her observations exactly as she had done before, never criticizing anyone personally, focusing only on the historical facts. The attorneys immediately reopened their research files. Quiet conversations filled the room. Reference books appeared. International legal databases loaded across multiple computer screens. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the senior attorney slowly removed his glasses. His voice carried none of its earlier certainty. "She is right." Another lawyer nodded. "If we had signed tomorrow morning exactly as written, the ownership transfer could have been delayed indefinitely under the surviving historical provisions." Complete silence settled over the room. Richard looked toward Naomi with quiet respect. She had not simply translated forgotten languages. She had protected months of negotiations from collapsing because she understood that words carried history as well as meaning. The executives who had laughed at her only hours before now looked at her with genuine admiration. Naomi did not celebrate. She quietly gathered the unused folders into neat stacks before asking the same simple question she had asked every evening since joining the household. "Is there anything else you need before I finish cleaning the room, sir?" The conference room remained silent even after the attorneys finished correcting the final agreement. Nobody rushed to leave anymore. The atmosphere that had once been filled with quiet confidence had transformed into thoughtful humility. Richard Castellano looked around the table, studying the faces of people he had trusted for years. Many of them were among the brightest professionals in their fields, yet every one of them had overlooked what Naomi Carter had recognized within minutes. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because they had approached the document with certainty instead of curiosity. Richard slowly closed the final folder before turning toward his legal team. "Leave every manuscript here," he said calmly. "I want each revision reviewed again tomorrow using Miss Carter's methodology." No one objected. The lead attorney gave a respectful nod before gathering his notes. As the room gradually emptied for the second time that evening, several executives paused beside Naomi on their way out. The same people who had smiled at her expense only hours earlier now thanked her sincerely for preventing an expensive legal mistake. Naomi accepted every word with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the day. She neither reminded them of their earlier laughter nor sought recognition for changing the outcome of the negotiations. She simply wished each person a pleasant evening before returning to organize the remaining folders on the table. Richard noticed that humility more than anything else. Many people became proud after proving themselves right. Naomi seemed relieved that the documents themselves had finally been understood. Once the last attorney disappeared into the hallway, Richard walked toward the conference room windows. Chicago shimmered beneath the night sky, its towers reflecting thousands of lights across the river. He had spent years believing that experience alone allowed him to judge people accurately within moments. Today that belief had quietly collapsed. He turned back toward Naomi. She was carefully aligning chairs around the conference table, restoring the room exactly as she had done after countless meetings that nobody would remember. The difference tonight was that Richard could no longer see an invisible employee. He saw someone whose knowledge had protected his interests without asking for credit, whose dignity had remained untouched by ridicule, and whose character had stayed unchanged by praise. "Miss Carter," he said softly. Naomi looked up from the final chair she had straightened. "Yes, sir." Richard walked toward the head of the conference table where the first challenge of the afternoon had begun. He rested one hand on the polished wood before speaking. "Earlier today I asked you to translate a document because I assumed you could not." Naomi listened quietly. Richard continued without looking away. "I intended to make a point." He paused briefly before adding, "Instead, you taught me one." Naomi remained silent. She understood that some moments deserved space rather than immediate replies. Richard drew a slow breath. "I judged your uniform before I ever considered your mind." The admission hung gently in the still room. It carried no dramatic flourish, only honest reflection. Naomi answered with the same kindness that had shaped every conversation between them. "Most people do, sir." There was no resentment in her voice, only acceptance born from experience. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. "Does it become easier?" Naomi thought carefully before answering. "No, sir. But I learned that bitterness only gives those moments a second victory." Richard looked at her with genuine respect. That single sentence revealed as much wisdom as every translation she had completed that afternoon. It explained why disappointment had never stolen her dignity. She had refused to allow unfair judgments to define the person she continued becoming. Richard glanced once more toward the ancient manuscripts resting safely inside their protective cases. They had preserved forgotten knowledge across centuries because someone had believed those words still mattered. Standing before him was another kind of forgotten treasure, not hidden by time, but by assumption. Naomi quietly picked up the empty silver coffee tray and prepared to leave the conference room. Before she reached the door, Richard spoke one final time. "Tomorrow morning, do not report to housekeeping." Naomi turned with quiet surprise. Richard offered a small, thoughtful smile that carried none of the cold confidence from earlier that day. "We have a different conversation waiting for us, and this time I would rather begin by asking questions than making assumptions." The following morning the mansion awakened exactly as it always had. Housekeepers polished marble floors before sunrise. Gardeners trimmed the hedges lining the circular driveway. The kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread as sunlight spilled through towering windows. Yet for Naomi Carter, nothing felt ordinary. She stood outside Richard Castellano's private library wearing the same neatly pressed housekeeping uniform she had worn every day for 3 months. In one hand, she carried a small notebook used for cleaning schedules. In the other, she carried quiet uncertainty. A member of the household staff opened the heavy oak door with a respectful smile. "Mr. Castellano is waiting for you." Naomi stepped inside. The library was peaceful, lined from floor to ceiling with books collected from around the world. Ancient maps rested beneath glass displays. Restored manuscripts occupied climate-controlled cabinets. Morning light filtered across rich walnut shelves, giving the room the calm dignity of a university rather than the office of one of the most influential men in Chicago. Richard stood beside the fireplace instead of behind his desk. As Naomi entered, he placed a simple folder on the table between them. "Good morning, Miss Carter." "Good morning, sir." Richard gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Please sit." Naomi accepted the invitation. Richard opened the folder. There were no contracts filled with complicated legal language. No employment forms. No executive agreements. Instead, there was a single sheet of paper containing only a few sentences. "Yesterday," Richard began, "you protected months of work by sharing knowledge that everyone else overlooked. More importantly, you reminded me that wisdom and dignity are impossible to measure by appearance." He gently turned the paper toward her. "I would like to offer you a position as historical language and cultural research consultant for every manuscript, archive, and historical acquisition connected to my foundation." Naomi stared quietly at the page. She read each line twice before looking up. "Sir, this position is far beyond anything I expected." Richard smiled softly. "It is exactly where you belonged long before you arrived here." Naomi remained silent for several moments. Then she slowly closed the folder without signing anything. Richard did not appear disappointed. Instead, he waited. Finally, Naomi spoke. "May I ask you one question before I answer?" "Of course." "Why me?" Richard looked toward the shelves surrounding them before answering. "Because yesterday I saw something that cannot be taught in any university. Intelligence earned my respect. Humility earned my trust. You corrected every mistake without embarrassing anyone. You defended the truth instead of your own pride. That is much harder to find than talent." Naomi lowered her eyes, deeply moved by words she had not expected to hear again after losing the career she once loved. She slowly reopened the folder before taking the pen Richard had placed beside it. Her signature appeared beneath the offer with steady confidence. Richard stood and extended his hand. Naomi accepted it with a warm smile. There was no applause, no audience, no dramatic celebration. Only a quiet handshake between two people who understood that genuine respect never needed witnesses. During the following weeks, the atmosphere throughout the mansion changed in subtle ways. Attorneys greeted Naomi by name instead of walking past her. Visiting historians requested her opinion before finalizing translations. The housekeeping staff celebrated her success because she never forgot the people who had worked beside her. Although her responsibilities changed, she continued joining the kitchen staff for lunch whenever she could, reminding everyone that gratitude should never disappear with opportunity. Richard noticed those small choices more than any professional achievement. One afternoon, he found the old housekeeping apron neatly folded inside Naomi's office drawer. "You kept it," he observed. Naomi smiled gently. "It reminds me that every honest job deserves respect." Richard nodded thoughtfully. He understood that the apron no longer represented loss. It represented resilience. Months later, the corrected Florence Agreement was completed successfully using Naomi's research, and several universities requested permission to publish her discoveries. Her name gradually returned to academic circles, not because she demanded recognition, but because truth eventually found its way back into the light. Richard often thought about the first words he had spoken to her in the conference room. He had challenged her because he believed her uniform defined her limits. Looking back, he realized the greatest translation of that extraordinary day had never appeared on ancient parchment. It had happened quietly inside his own heart, where judgment gave way to respect. And that day, everyone who had witnessed the silence around that conference table remembered what true dignity looks like.